Okay.
Yeah, don't get away.
So Lelia, we are live whenever you guys want to get started.
We were just telling Alma that she was going to be live. So. Perfect. Hi everyone, I'm Lelia. Thank you for being here and listening to me. I'm going to do a quick introduction for our wonderful guest here, and then she's going to talk about her fabulous new book. So I have worked here since we opened, and our first year, one of our events that we had was Alma for her first book, her first published book, I should say. I think you had maybe written others before that, or no?
They never themselves away.
That's you know what, this one did, and it was great. So I've been a huge fan of Alma's ever since then. Not only is she an incredible writer, she's also just an amazing person. She's been such a supporter of the store for all these years. 11 of them, or however many it is at this point, I think. 11 and a half, maybe. A while. So, you know, I'm sure you're all at least a little familiar with Alma and her genres. But if not, I'll take you on a little journey. She's got something for everyone. I'm always like, if you're shopping for someone, there's going to be an Alma Katsu book for them. What do they like? Historical, horror, you know, character-driven, research, very thoroughly researched. She's got it. She's got it covered. So espionage, her latest one, The Fervor, is in the genre that she's crafted several of sort of historical fiction with a supernatural twist. And, you know, I think it's so impressive how she does so much research on a lot of them are based on, you know, very true stories, whether it's the Donner Party or the Titanic and the Britannic, or in this case, Japanese internment camps in World War II. And it's just incredible how she combines the supernatural occult horror elements to the very real horrors that, you know, are the history aspect of it. So I know that's not like a great gift book, but I promise you, it's great. It's everyone, they're gonna love it. Or, you know, you can get Red Widow if you like a little espionage based on her own, I don't want to say history, that makes me sound like, yes, her storied career in intelligence. So, all of which is to say, we are so thrilled to have Alma back here again. I'm going to read you all since I realized I didn't really claim anything helpful. But I did have a short blurb that I wanted to share from someone who did say something helpful. That was Mr. Stephen Graham Jones, who they know as the author of My Heart is a Chainsaw. And he said about The Fervor is set in 1944, but it's about the world we live in now, and that's terrifying. If you know Stephen Graham Jones, he really knows a lot about terrifying, because his books are very, very scary. And so is this one. And you know, I never read horror, so it's like when I do, it's always Alma. So in any case, Alma, thank you so much for everything, and thank you all for coming out and supporting her. Buy a book and buy one for your friends, and you know, just give them to everybody you see. And I'm going to do a round of applause for Alma. Tell everyone about it. Talk about it on TikTok.
That's right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for that introduction. That was lovely. I have to say thank you to One More Page, because really, they're the ones supporting me. They've had me here for every one of my books. They're incredibly generous, not only to me, but all the authors in the DC area. So do your best to support and get all of your books here. Thank you all for coming. It's asking a lot, I know, in this time, these uncertain times. Who knows, you know, even a week away, whether or not we're going to be able to make it out the door. We're all wearing our masks again, except for me. But I'm tested a lot, so I think you're okay. You know, so I really, really appreciate, you know, you guys coming out and bringing traffic, which seems to be back, and everything. So, yes, I'm here to tell you a little bit about the book, but before we get started, I promised you the cookie stories. Okay. So the cookies were kind of a surprise. Somebody showed up with a box of these cookies. It's a friend of mine who I had hired to make cookies for the book party we were supposed to have here for my last historical horror novel, The Deep, which is the Titanic story. It had this beautiful deep blue cover, and the friend was just starting her cookie business, so I thought I'll help her out. So I ordered 6 dozen cookies, because we've had over 70 people here for an event before. Pretty packed, we were all drinking, so it was fine. And then while I was on tour on the West Coast, the pandemic broke out, and we were sent home, and everything. You remember those days, right? So I called my friend, and I'm like, "What am I going to do?" And she said, "They'll freeze for 6 months." So we put them in the freezer, thinking by then we'll all be back outside. And 6 months came, and there were 6 dozen cookies in the freezer. So we started to eat them. You see, it's like a slab of sugar, right? 6 dozen cookies. We gave some away, but we ate most of them, and I'm surprised I'm not that many. Anyway, so enjoy. And sorry there wasn't a cookie for everybody, but apparently she was short 1 dozen, like she owed me a dozen, and I forgot all about it. And this is how honest she is. I owe you a dozen cookies, and she dropped them off here and everything. So, all right. And if you need a good cookie baker, it's Sweet Nubbins Bakery. You can find her on Facebook. And I think she lives in Glen Elg, something like that. So not too far away. All right. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the book. I'm going to get started with my notes. I apologize for that. It's been like a really crazy launch. Even though today is the day the book came out, we've been doing publicity for a little while. So I have a feeling once I get started talking, it's all going to come out. But there were a few things I wanted to say. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So if there's anything you want to ask about this book, about my other books, about research, about why the hell I'm still doing this. Okay, so people locked up in detention camps. Children separated from their parents. White nationalist groups spreading fake news about minorities and taking to arms. Anger against the other seems to be spreading like a disease through the air. What year do you think I'm talking about? Do you think it's 2020? 2021? No. Imagine my surprise when I found all these things in 1944. So the fervor is set in the waning days of World War II. And if you read any of my other historical horror novels, you know that it's like an ensemble cast. So there are 4 main characters, and we follow their lives in the book. The first one opens with an explosion that happens on Gerhardt Mountain in Oregon. And this is a true story. This is an actual event. Archie Mitchell, one of our characters, who's a pastor, he's just taken over the congregation in Bly, Oregon. And he and his wife, Elsie, who's pregnant, decide they're going to take 5 of the Sunday school children on a picnic on the mountain and do a little fishing. And so Elsie is taking the children, and they're starting down the path to the picnic area, and Archie is getting the stuff out of the car, the picnic things, when there's an explosion, and all 5 children and Elsie are killed. And like I said, this is a real event. This is the only deaths attributed to the war on the U.S. mainland that happened during World War II. In my book, now I'll revert to the fictional part, Archie is shocked. He's blown back from the car. His hearing, he can't hear. But he remembers the last thing he thought he saw was a woman in a kimono standing on the side of the road when he was driving by. But he knows there's no Japanese in Oregon. They were taken away years ago and put in internment camps. The second character is Mako Briggs. Mako is a Japanese woman. She was sent to America to wed a Japanese businessman. And this was very common. Back then on the West Coast, Japanese men outnumbered Japanese women 30 to 1. So they had matchmakers back in Japan that were sending over brides. But she doesn't marry the businessman. She ends up marrying his friend, a white man named Jamie, who's a crop duster. And when Pearl Harbor breaks out, he, like a lot of other men, sign up for the war effort, and he's shipped out to be a pilot. And Mako and their daughter, Aiko, are sent to the Minidoka camp in Idaho. Life's tough. When she's in the camp, though, Mako notices this weird disease seems to be spreading through the camp. And with it, when people become infected with it, they start to become very agitated and then very hostile and aggressive, and fights seem to be breaking out. And what makes it even worse is that the authorities don't seem to be doing anything about it. They seem to just be standing by and letting it happen, and she can't understand why this is going on, so she decides to investigate. Our third character is Fran Gerswald, who's a reporter for a daily newspaper in Lincoln, Nebraska. And she happens to be on a little trip to a cabin in the woods one night when she sees an explosion in the sky. And she and the person who's there with her follow it through the woods, and they find the remnants of, they're not sure what it is. It looks like it could be a parachute or it could be a big balloon. So when she finds out what's going on, she decides that she wants to write this up. Not only because, her curiosity is piqued, but because she kind of feels like this is her ticket out of the pink collar ghetto of the newspaper, the women's pages, where, a lot of women reporters, are live out their careers. Her editor doesn't like it though, and she ends up getting fired. But she still decides she's going to pursue this, even though the army and the military and the sheriff's departments everywhere she goes don't seem to want her to investigate the story. I'll remind you about that because we'll get back to that in a little bit too. And then the last of the point of view characters is Eiko, the daughter. And Eiko is a really bright young kid. Her mother is always telling her that she reminds her of Mako's father, who was a scientist in Japan. She's very intelligent, she picks up languages really well, really quickly, and she has great artistic ability. But the thing is, she's always drawing these Japanese monsters, like kids today, actually, drawing a lot of manga. Yeah, from the stories that Mako told her, from her own childhood. And, but not to give away too much, but one day, Eiko is told that her mother in the camp has died. And Eiko decides she's going to escape and go back to Seattle, where their home was, because she's convinced that's where her father's going to go looking for her. So she escapes with the help of, let's just say, a kitsune, a Japanese spirit animal. That's the fox you've probably seen, the fox with 9 tails, who she believes is her reincarnation of her mother, and that her mother is guiding her back home. So those are the 4 characters. The 4 characters are all, in search of different things. Archie's kind of looking for forgiveness for his wife's death. He feels responsible that he wasn't with her, that if he had been with her, that maybe he could have saved her. Mako's got a lot on her mind. If you read the book, struggling with this country that still isn't accepting her, and things have only been made worse by the war, struggling with the situation her people are in, struggling with the position that her husband is in. But what's more immediate is the disease, the outbreak in the camps. Fran is also struggling to sort of find her place in the world, and now to find a job because she's been fired. But really what they're all looking for is the truth. They're all, trying to find some version of the truth. And the whole thing is tied together with an episode that happened a while back when Mako was a child. Her father, the research scientist, took her with him on a research trip to a remote island in the north of Japan. And the interesting thing about the island is that it was reputed to be very close to the Japanese underworld. So that's a little hint back to the supernatural element. So that's the setup for the book. I really wasn't planning to talk more about the story itself. I don't want to give away any spoilers. I'm kind of notorious for that. But I do know that people really get interested in the history that are in the book. So I was going to talk about a couple things, and then, like I said, happy to answer any questions. So one is about the camps itself. And also, if I forget, because that's also very neat, remind me to go back and talk about why I write the books, right? About history repeating itself and how it just seems to happen from book to book. So one of the reasons I'm happy to have written the book is the Japanese internment is very personal to my family. My mom's Japanese, she was not interned, but my husband's family, I laugh because it's so ridiculous, were all interned. They were at Tohas. And when I was growing up, of course, I had heard about it. When I was young, it wasn't so far removed from World War II. So we actually heard a lot about what happened during the war, right? So I knew about the camps and I knew about the fire balloons. But that's a part of American history that's kind of dying out, the camps. People still hear about it, and I understand they still teach it a bit in school, but they're not getting much of the story. And the Japanese community itself is kind of mourning the fact that we're losing a lot of the people who were in the camps. They're dying out. I mean, one of my husband's cousins was a child in the camp, and he's in his 70s now. So the other thing is, a lot of the folks that live in camp don't like to talk about their experience. A lot of them refuse to talk about it through their whole life. And so we are literally losing these stories. I'm going to talk a little bit about the factual stuff about the camp, but I will be more than happy to tell you the other part of it that I learned. And that's the thing, too, is, what we're taught in history is that the camps were set up, because of Pearl Harbor, and it was because they were concerned that the people of Japanese descent, whether they were Japanese citizens or American citizens, would spy or commit sabotage. And that's why but that is not the complete story behind the camp. So we'll talk about that. And now I have to put my glasses on. Because like I said, I'm getting old. The other interesting thing for me, maybe not for anybody else, is, as earlier mentioned, I do a lot of research for these books. I didn't have to do so much for this book because I knew it so well. I learned it through my cousin's family, through their stories. We had to pull them out of them, like snakes, that the snakes. I was going to say snakes from a box. Does anyone pull snakes from a box? Yeah. We had to pull the stories out of them, but we watched a lot of documentaries and we read a lot of books because we were very interested in this. And so, for once, I actually kind of knew a lot what that was going on. And like I said, I that's how I know there's a lot that you don't learn from school. So, the first thing is, you probably know there are some camps. Where were these camps? You think they'd be where the Japanese populations were. No. They were Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, which is the location that's mentioned in the books, Tule Lake, which is in Northern California, Manzanar, which is, they always say it's near LA. It's not. It's east of Fresno. Yeah, Topaz in Utah, that's where my in-laws were kept. One in Colorado went by two names, Amachi or Granada. You'll see it referred to one of two ways. There were two in Arizona, Poston and Gila River, and two in Arkansas, a hotbed of Japanese life, Rower and Jerome. But the other thing is, there were a lot more facilities than the main camps. There were detention centers where the Japanese troublemakers were kept. A lot of first generation EC or the leaders in the Japanese American community were kept separate from the rest of the population. There are a lot of camps that they moved people through or put them temporarily here, or relocation camps where they were being processed out. But they were all away from major population centers. The camps were usually in these remote, desert, isolated areas where there wouldn't be this reminder, right? And also because then they'd be away from the West Coast exclusion zone. How many people? I think some people were under the impression it was a small amount of people. 120,000 people were put in the camps, of which 70 to 80,000 were U.S. citizens. That's like if someone just came and took you out of your house, right? U.S. citizens. No specific reason why they were brought under. So, as I mentioned, the reason that was given, and that you hear in the history books, is that the War Department considered the Japanese at risk for being saboteurs or for spying. And there was this belief, and we'll get into why this happened, that even people who were born in this country, who were U.S. citizens, were more loyal to Japan than the country of their birth. None of this was true. And they knew it. The administration knew this, and the War Department knew it. In the time running up to Pearl Harbor, the administration knew that they were going to be under a lot of pressure to join the war effort. They were already under a lot of pressure to join the war effort. And they conducted studies to see whether or not there was a threat from the Japanese. And every study, two for the War Department, one for FDR's own office, came back saying no. The assessment was there was no threat from the Japanese. So they knew this, but FDR still signed the executive order. And why do you think that was? Same thing we feel today, political pressure, right? There were a number of congressmen who were kind of grandstanding and really advocating for this. So why was there so much anti-Japanese public sentiment? I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, but as a former political analyst, looking at the past, I have to say a big contributing factor is that there were decades of open racism, particularly on the West Coast, against the Chinese and then the Japanese. There were many white national and nativist groups, like I said, openly active. When you read the book, you'll see there's a nationalist group in there, and I have flyers and handouts and stuff that they're giving. All the language that I used was based on things I actually saw that were printed at the time. I couldn't put the little pictures in, but honestly, I mean, it would turn your stomach today. And this was just out in the open. People just said these things, right? And they, like I said, they believed that Japanese were not loyal to the United States at all. Speaking of which, you know, like I said, the big argument was that they had to be out of the exclusion zone because they would be spies or saboteurs. They conducted study after the war, not one case of Japanese heritage person spying or committing sabotage in the United States. So completely unfounded, right? I can get very passionate about this, but just because, like several of the people in this room I know also worked in the intelligence business where we had to do assessments, right, on civil, internal arrest in other countries. And so what you see when you look at what especially the white nationalist groups were doing, is comparable to any of those, right? One group demonizes the other groups, compares them to vermin, compares them to insects, so they can distance themselves so that it's okay to perpetrate violence against the other group. This is usually done at the behest of some kind of would-be dictator or autocrat, you know, who leads a lot of propaganda and that sort of thing. So when I went back and looked at the history for this, that is exactly what struck me. This is that same old campaign, you know, of hatred that we see. But if you look at the cases too, what was driving this, it's also the same, and that is economic competition. It's fear of economic competition by, you know, minority class that's coming up in society. And these groups too were responsible for, they brought court cases to try to keep Chinese and Japanese from getting citizenship, from being able to purchase land or have any property. Okay, so the timeline for the executive order, EO 9066, which is the executive order that put people in the camps, it was issued by FDR on February 19th, 1942. That's just a few weeks really after Pearl Harbor. But the first order sending the families to the camps didn't come out until March 24th. When the order came out, families for the area that you lived in had 1 week to relocate to the camps. So that is not enough time to sell your property or put your, you know, affairs in order. And I'm sure you've heard this too, but, you know, we heard it from the people who were there. You know, having to sell things for pennies on the dollar. Or some of your neighbors would just wait until you were carted off and then they'd take whatever that was left. Your house, your cars, your trucks. My in-laws had a floristry business in Berkeley. Imagine what that would be worth today. And their house, right? You know, some neighbors were good and promised they'd watch, you know, their neighbor's stuff or put it in storage, and some did. But many, many more just, you know, given the benefit of the doubt, didn't think the neighbors were ever coming back, right? And sold the property or took the property or something like that. By June, all the Japanese had been removed and placed in army custody. This is the part that people find surprising. The executive order was revoked effective January 2nd, 1945. The last camp didn't close until March of 1946. And the reason why is that many Japanese were afraid to go home because there was still so much violence against them, a lot of death threats if you return and that sort of thing. And that really spurred a migration of Japanese towards the East Coast. So what caused the executive order to be rescinded? There were court cases going on. One thing I'll say is there weren't as many as you think, because there was a lot of pressure on the Japanese to be model citizens. And this was like among the first things that I heard from my father-in-law, that we we had to show them that they were wrong about us. And we showed them by doing everything they asked and never complaining and never causing a fuss. And so while that wasn't universally true, and there were cases of, like I said, that went to court and people went to jail over it, were pulled out of the camps and put in a real jail, that sort of thing. By and large, it was this appeasement kind of thing. And that ended up contributing to shame actually later. That a lot of those who were in the camps didn't want to talk about it because they actually felt ashamed later that they didn't fight it more, that they just took it, which is kind of an Asian thing, right? That you're just going to accept it. Really, they were damned if they do and damned if they don't. And we can go into the conditions. I mean, if you saw that show, The Terror, where they did the Japanese internment one, I only saw like the first episode or so. But the way they set it up was absolutely according to what I had heard from people who've been in the camps. Like in the San Francisco area, they were put into Frantan racetrack, but it hadn't been reconditioned at all. Like there was still manure in the stalls, and they were just told this family in this stall, this family, and that's all, and they had to like clean it. So if that's how it starts, right? You can just imagine how the rest of it was, and then they're shipped out in a railway car, to the prairie where there's just a stick shack that's been set up with nothing. No furniture, nothing inside. You are ashamed that you're in this situation, that anyone could believe that you would be guilty enough that you deserve this kind of treatment. I mean, these were all like you, law-abiding citizens. Imagine if this happened to you. And all this contributed to their just being ashamed that they had been treated like this, So they didn't talk about it for years. Anyway, the case that turned it over, this is a great one. If you're a Fed or an ex-Fed like me, you'll love it. So the case they chose to go to the Supreme Court was a woman, Japanese American, she was second generation, who worked for the Department of Motor Vehicles in California. And they picked her because she didn't speak Japanese. Right? She had an American name. She wore American clothes. Her brother was fighting for America in the army. She had never shown any sort of overt sentiment towards Japan, never gave them any reason to doubt her loyalty to the United States. She was the perfect case. I have her name right here. And because of that, they overturned it. And the reason why I thought that was so amazing is because that's me. That's every Japanese American person I know, right? We don't speak Japanese. We may eat a little Japanese food once in a while, but we're not like overtly Japanese. And that's probably how you feel about your nationality and your friends feel about their nationality. And again, why it makes it so bizarre that they just rounded up 120,000 people and stuffed them right in camps in the prairie. And I hope that more people think this way. It'll never happen again. Her name was Mitsui Endo. The other reason why I think this is so important is those of you who went through 9/11, and there's probably almost everybody in this room, probably may remember after that happened, there was a very short span of debate whether or not Arabs in this country should be put in internment camps. And it didn't last more than, I think, 3 days before it was shut down. And I like to think it's because we learned something from the experience with Japanese. And if nothing else comes of it, that kind of made it worthwhile. I don't know. Okay, let's see. Like I said, people remained in the camps because they feared violence. If I got on too long, man, I can just guess how much the loss of property, that the Japanese on the West Coast suffered in 1983 dollars, 2.7 billion. Imagine how much today, right? Like I said, they lost everything. Okay, that's all I had prepared to talk about the camps. I'm going to talk about the fire balloons real quickly, just because it's so bizarre. And they're in the book. How many people here had ever heard of the fire balloons? Okay, a few. Like I said, I had heard about it when I was a kid. I don't know if it was because I was just a magnet for weird or because I was half Japanese, so it appealed to me, but I had heard about them. And nobody hears about them today. So you'll see them in the book. Like I said, it was the cause of the only deaths on U.S. mainland. These big balloons Japan sent over to cause fires on the West Coast and the Midwest to kind of strike fear and terror into Americans' hearts. Sounds crazy, right? Wait till you hear the story behind them. I'm surprised they even worked at all. So what happened was, shortly after Pearl Harbor, there was this thing called Doolittle's Raid. How many of you guys probably know that? Okay. So America wanted to strike back on the Japanese mainland. And it was kind of a crazy idea because planes could not fly that far yet. And so, I forget his first name, but Doolittle, the commander of the...
Jimmy Doolittle.
Thank you. With his little group. I mean, it was really a Hail Mary pass, right? And you guys probably know all the details, but I believe it was the first time where they did a takeoff on an aircraft carrier at sea. I mean, that had never been done before.
Never done it with a bomber.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great aircraft. It was the only one that would get on there with that.
I mean, it sounds completely crazy, and they managed to strike the mainland, and I think he overshot and came down in China or something.
That was their only destination.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Frozen.
Right. So that made the emperor, Japanese emperor, so mad. He wanted to strike the U.S. mainland, right? Hawaii wasn't enough. But they all thought, it can't be done. We can't get aircraft all the way across the Pacific. We can't have, submarines coming up because there was controls on the West Coast. They just couldn't see how it could be done. So they launched a bunch of programs at the same time, and this was like in 42. Well, the fire balloons weren't released until 44, 45. So they worked on it along with these other programs for 2 years. The kind of sad thing is, like, this is one of the few that actually made it to fruition. You can imagine what the other ones were. This was only possible because they had Japanese school children make the rice paper, the washi paper, at the school, enough washi paper to make these balloons. They were about 30 feet in diameter. And they had these very rudimentary incendiary devices hanging from the bottom, and a few other rudimentary, like, control things for ballots and all this stuff. And the balloons were supposed to fly over all the way from Japan, and then when they hit a certain altitude, start to descend, and then, So they launched several thousand of these balloons. 285 sightings were recorded by the authorities in the West Coast. I think as far east as Michigan, maybe one of them. I know. Also in the Pacific, of course. Some made it down to Hawaii, some up to Alaska. This incident that we talked about in the book was the only serious one. It caused a few fires, but no real damage. It did knock out the power lines to one of the, I want to say, like, uranium processing for the Manhattan Project, believe it or not, isn't that weird? But they got it back online. Anyway, and the only reason that the balloons were able to make it here is because they rode the jet stream, which we didn't know about in America. But a Japanese scientist is the one who discovered the jet stream. And I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, that's all I have prepared to tell you. So I'll be happy to answer questions, or if you jog my memory enough, I'm sure other crazy facts will come up.
Were you going to say something about Fran? I can't remember that.
No, that's probably as much as I want to say
Okay.
about Fran. What else was I going to say? Maybe just about writing them in general. So the first historical horror novel I wrote was The Hunger, which was about the Donner Party. And I did that kind of straightforward. Did research on the history of the Donner Party, which is pretty wacky. Kind of the same thing. Like, what we know, the average person just scratches the surface. A lot of really insane things happened on that trip. But I wrote the book, and then afterwards I would get this question: why should we care about the Donner Party today? Well, really, why should we care about the Donner Party? And it made me think. Okay, well. The other thing is, a lot of people say, it seems a little political. I wrote it during the 2016 presidential campaign. So as a writer, right, how could it not be? As a writer, you get a little nervous, right, especially when you write history, that you're, putting too much of yourself or your thoughts into it. So So I went back and I kind of looked what was going on in the country back then in 1846, I think it was. And luckily, some of the same things that we were struggling with in 2016, they were struggling with then. So then I started working on the second book, The Deep, which is about the sinking of the Titanic. And I thought, I'm going to learn from my mistakes. What were the big social issues at the time? And darn if they weren't similar to what we were going through a couple years.
You don't change much.
It really doesn't. Because for that, the two big issues were that the gap between the wealthy and the poor was widening. It was like the worst in history. And I used to have a bunch of figures that would make your jaws fall to the ground, right? And then also women were struggling for the right to vote. And women felt like, they were being marginalized in society. That would never happen again. So it was just, I was just gobsmacked at how much history. And then when I was doing the research for this, it was like, I'm just going to throw all pretext out the window because, as you probably know, since a certain political figure came out and said that the Chinese are responsible for COVID, that it was a plot on their part, hate crimes against Asian Americans has risen over 300% in this country. People are being killed, beaten and killed almost every day, and it's usually women, elderly Asian women.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Numbers are staggering. So
Makes sense.
they're helpless. They're not going to fight back. Yeah. So that's why I had the privilege of writing about this book. I know that sounds really bleak and horrible, but I think it is still kind of relevant for today. And we've been getting some great reviews that have sort of picked up on that. So I hope, thank you so much for being here today. I hope you give it a read, and if you like it, that maybe you encourage some of your friends to read it as well. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
What was one of the biggest surprises you got from researching FERVOR?
It was the white nationalist groups. Like I had, we all know the Ku Klux Klan, right? They weren't alone. And they were really active on the West Coast against Chinese. So for a long time, like pre-World War I. And very active, very active. As a matter of fact, the group that I modeled my group of white nationalists after still exists today. Has celebrities who are like honorary members, and I don't know if they've kind of apologized for everything they did. I don't know, but I'm amazed that they still are so in the open. Yeah, it was, and as someone of, even though I don't look Asian, I'm that sort of, what was it that they said on Parks and Rec of the one character, just this sort of, I know you're not white, but I don't know what you are, kind of thing. So, to see the handbills and the drawings and the way people were depicted just makes your blood run cold. And to know they're out there. Again, such a cheerful attitude I have. What?
How many camps did you visit? Did you go to?
I didn't visit any.
You haven't seen any?
No, because I'm terrible. No. One thing I will, because I kind of felt like I've been to a lot of them. I mean,
Sure.
I've seen a million pictures and saw the documentaries and saw my in-laws' family's artifacts. What was super neat and so weird, this is again what I mean about, it's like a story that's under the radar in America. When one of my neighbors found out I was writing this book, she said, "Oh, my family had been at Minidoka, and I have all their records. Would you like to see them?" And she gave me this folder full of mimeos and stuff like that. That was all the camp newspaper and the hand-drawn map and all the stuff that you could never get anywhere.
Yeah.
And she lent them to me. So if the camp feels like you're right there, it's because I had all this stuff. And I didn't want to give it back to her, but I knew that would really be the jerky thing to do. So I gave it back. Yeah, it's priceless.
Yeah, that really is quite a find.
She's so sweet. Yes, sir.
Your commentary on that one case that the woman won when she sued or made a case, you said her her brother was in the military fighting?
Mhm.
How was that possible?
So I don't have the exact date, but at a certain point when they were still in the camps, the military did decide to allow people of Japanese descent to join the military. They got, I can't remember how many thousands from the camp, but at least 10,000. And more in Hawaii where there was no internment, of course.
Right.
My father-in-law joined the Army. Yeah, he was a teenager in camps and went immediately into the Army. I had the privilege of working with some people. They were all retiring when I started. This was a while ago. I can't tell you why all us Japanese Americans were together in the same office. But yeah, some of them had been interpreters for
Oh,
units,
no, that
which is
makes
the
sense,
most
yeah.
dangerous position. Yeah.
Yeah, that was very dangerous.
So the battalions or brigades that were made up of all of the Japanese, I think it was the
I think it was the 442nd.
442nd
Yeah.
was the most decorated military unit ever.
Yeah.
Um,
Super brave
fought-
guys.
Yeah, they fought tremendously.
When you said they chose this woman to represent as a case that was going to win, who's going to get to the Supreme Court, who's they?
The lawyers. Like,
So who is it? Like,
I can't remember if it was like ACLU
Yeah,
at the time or some fledgling, but yeah, they were sort of trying to pick the right case that they knew, was pretty ironclad going forward.
Classic lawyer style.
Gotta applaud them because they won.
Well, that's what you want to do.
Yep. Want to see the good guys win? Yes, sir.
So when you write historical fiction, you can end up going down that rabbit hole of information. How do you know, as a writer, how do you know when to stop, when you have enough, and get that information off the page?
So I give the least popular answer to this ever, because I get asked this a lot. So I used to be a researcher. That's what I did for 30 years in the intelligence business, is researching, right? And so when you do that for a living, you can't just like research forever, right? You're really under the gun to make assessments. So you learn a lot of shortcuts and you learn to trust your judgment. But I used to get this question so much when I started touring for the Hunger. At least once every event, someone would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm trying to write historical fiction and I just can't seem to get started. I'm doing research and I can't seem to stop. So I actually have, I developed a workshop for this, and it really parallels how researchers, particularly intelligence analysts, work, right? So I can give you the short answer, but it actually all came out in a column that I wrote for Chuck Wendig today.
I know. That's why I mentioned.
Oh,
I would see you would talk. I was saying you would talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, terrible minds. He has great blogs.
He has a great blog, and he is, if you don't know Chuck, go check him out because he's amazing writer, an even more amazing person. He's like one of the most honest people I've ever met, even if it hurts him. And it frequently does.
And he's funny.
He's funny,
Very
he's hysterical. So the first thing is, actually know what your research question is. And I'm not saying this to you because I know you know what your research question is. But I meet a lot of writers who are like, I don't really know what my book's about. So I'm just going to start researching the period and the story will come to me. And that is like, no. Like when we do research projects, yeah, in the real world, we can't just say, I want to know something about hydrogen, but I don't really know what. So I'm just going to play around with it until a question comes to me. You have to like have a question, write it down, and that so you know what answer you're looking for. So know what it is you want to write about. I knew I wanted to write about the camps, but I really wanted to talk about injustice. So I knew like specific things I wanted to hone in on. I think the Titanic is maybe a better explanation because I didn't know anything about the Titanic, right? But I knew if I wrote a book about the Titanic, the thing I'm weakest on is the layout of the ship because I am not a sailor. So I really focused on that, like besides the history of it, but the layout, I got, deck plans and everything so I could move around that deck. You kind of have to know what you need to know and not be open. So that was the first step. The second step was, I know one of the things I tell people to do is, since most of us do most of our research online, it's hard to evaluate the reliability of your sources. And so I gave some tips for how to do that. And one big one is, and this is going to shock you, even the experts have found this out, like historians and PhD professors are not as good as fact checkers when it comes to determining whether or not a source is credible. So you really need to research broadly. So let's say you found a fact on a site. Don't just evaluate that site and decide from looking at that site whether or not you think it's credible or not, but to go across sites and look. Believe it or not, historians and PhD types tend to just look at one site. It's good to me, you know, NewYorkTimes.edu. So things like that. And then the other thing is in intelligence, we use probability scores to determine how much confidence we have in a source. We say it's probable, like 75 to 90%, we feel that's probably true. It goes down, possible, probably not possible, something like that. And I found that is really helpful for you, particularly if you're dealing with, you know, events that you're going to find a lot of kind of homemade stuff. So, for instance, the Donner Party, I actually had to rely a lot on homegrown genealogist work and diaries and things like that, where it's not like the New York Times is reporting on what the Donner Party ate, right? So, having my own sort of measuring system made it easier to decide which fact I was going to keep and which fact I was going to leave out. Otherwise, it starts to become this big washy morass, right? So those are probably my main tips, but I think there's a few more I'm just forgetting. Yes, sir.
You know, while you said you didn't visit anywhere, how much of that the encampment still remain?
I know. A lot of them are disappearing. Several of them have been sort of turned into museums, but there's not a lot left in some of them. I know that for sure. In a couple places, there may be just as a monument left.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So, considering your professional background, I heard you mention earlier, and I don't think surprise was the word you used, but it came across that way, about the internment camps. The history of the internment camps kind of surprised you. Knowing the history of our country, the Trail of Tears, the way Chinese Americans were treated in the 1850s, the Civil War, even recently as 9/11, even though the debate was 3 days, the after effects are still kind of showing themselves. I think that there was a case discussed on the Supreme Court today about keeping them in Mexico, right? Do you see things in the news or, you know, just in popular culture from your professional background that trigger thoughts like, oh, yep, I've seen this before, this makes sense?
That's a great question, and I really want to thank you for asking it, because even though I say I'm surprised, and we read the people who write the op-eds and other stuff, and they say they're surprised too, right? And after January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, a lot of us were surprised, even that it went that far or was that violent. Even though all the facts are constantly out in the open, slapping us in the face, everything that you brought up, I'm almost ashamed to say I'm surprised, and I wonder if it's a reflex that we have, because we're not really surprised. It's just that I think a lot of us feel helpless to do anything about it. And I know I still do, even though this makes me so mad. It makes me so mad as somebody who gave most of her constructive years to the federal government, right, fighting for this country, like other people in this room did. I know you did too, right? And it makes me so mad that I was so, what's the word I'm looking for, loyal to a country that treated my people like this and treats other people like this. Why can't we break that cycle? Well, yeah, there's that. But, you know, one thing we learned, okay, so I spent a lot of time working in humanitarian issues and societal issues and stuff. Demographics trumps all. There's not enough money that can overcome what demographics will force upon us. We're still more people than the rich people, right? Why can't we force a change? Just, it's frustrating. I wish I had an answer.
Hey, Alma, do you think that you mentioned that after the war, which to the Japanese Americans were ashamed to talk about what they had done. To now with after COVID, shaming of the Chinese. Do you think that Asian Americans are fighting back more against the racism? Do you see a change?
They're speaking
Of
out.
what?
They're speaking out. I know there's been some of the profile raised on the violence against Asian Americans, due to the politicizing of the issue. I don't know that they're fighting that. Again, and I'll say this, being half Asian, we're the good minority, right? We're the ones who are going to become your doctor, but we're not going to hit somebody with a crowbar when we get mad. So I'll tell you a couple stories about this. You really shouldn't go any further than this, but there's trivia. When I wrote the book, I was really surprised too, because this is the first time I've had a main character of Asian background, of my ethnicity. And I really had to fight to bring her up to be the main character. I said, you can't have white leads on the issue of the Japanese attorney. You see where that doesn't make sense, right? And it took some, people didn't get that, really. They didn't understand why. I don't know if you know this, I learned about it recently, you've heard of the book, The Boy in the Striped Pajama. Well, they call this the pajamification of social issues. That, and I didn't read that book, so I can't speak, but where you have the white perspective, but it's a blameless white perspective, they're not the oppressor, to sort of explain what's going on in this cultural issue. And when I heard about that, I was like, oh my God, absolutely, that's what they wanted, right? And I'm not going to tell you who they are. But my publisher, my editor, who's Korean American, sided with me. But at one point, somebody came back and said, Mako bashes a lot of people over the head in this book. Would she do that? A nice Japanese woman like that? I said, hell yes. And I wish I had bashed more people over the head. When I was younger, I was amazed at how good it made me feel. And also, writing was such a surprise. Because I really channeled my mother in the beginning. My mom was this very nice, very polite, classic Japanese woman. And she went to her grave like that. And she was really scarred for life by the way she was treated by Americans when she came to America after World War II. To the point where every Pearl Harbor Day, she refused to leave her room in the nursing home. Because she didn't like the looks she thought she was getting. I don't know if she was getting any looks. It was a nursing home, so maybe. But that was the generation, and I think we do have to sort of break that. You know me, I'm not the kind that's gonna let somebody. Yeah, I'll hit somebody else.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you did a lot of bashing in your day.
You did. Yes, sir.
So the lead character is really a secret embellishment of you?
No, but there's probably a bit of me in it. And it really did feel good to be able to say the things that I didn't realize I was holding in.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a self-realization at times.
It is. That's the thing about writing. It's like learning about yourself in public. It's a little scary. Well, if there's yes, ma'am.
No, I was just going to say, I think we have time for one more, if anybody has one more question, and then if you're okay signing books. But if there are no more questions, then...
You can eat your cookies and go into a 9-minute coma. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming.
I'll try and clear some of the chairs away so you all can make a line for anyone that has a book they want to get signed. And thank you all so much for being here. So if you